Pauline Dakin always suspected that there was just something off about her family. And years later, she would find out she was right. When she was 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. But after they separated and Pauline, her mother, and brother had moved into another house, Pauline noticed her mom started to act really anxious all the time. Her mother told her and her brother that they were going to go on a vacation to Winnipeg. They went inside their new vacation home, and Ruth informed her children that they were actually never going back to Vancouver. And when Pauline and her brother said, "Why?" Pauline said, "When you're old enough, I'll explain everything." But right as she was starting to feel normal, her mother told her and her brother that they needed to move right now all over again. Their mother made them swear they would tell no one about this move. Once in New Brunswick, Pauline's mother still was just incredibly anxious and paranoid about something. The kids just had no idea what it was. When Pauline was 23 years old, her mother called her and said, "Hey, I'd like to meet you at a motel. I'm finally ready to tell you everything about your childhood." And so she walks up to her mom and she waves and she's about to speak when her mother just looks up at her and puts her finger over her lips, telling her to be quiet. And then she jams an envelope into Pauline's hands, and on the envelope it just says, "Don't say anything. Put your jewelry inside of this envelope. It's probably bugged. I will explain everything inside. Just please don't speak." When they went inside, there was a man sitting in the middle of the room that Pauline immediately recognized. It was the reverend of their church when they used to live in Vancouver. His name was Stan Sears. Pauline remembers periodically seeing Stan show up in Winnipeg and New Brunswick to visit with Pauline's mother. Pauline's mother confessed to her that in fact she and Stan had fallen in love, and in fact they had had a secret relationship from the time they lived in Vancouver. Her mother explained that the reason they had had to move so many times during her childhood was because Pauline's father, Warren, was actually a mobster and was a key member of an organized crime syndicate in Vancouver. Right after they separated, Pauline's mother found out she had a hit put on her head. Stan also found out that he had a hit on his head because Ruth discovered that the mob wanted to kill him too because they knew about their relationship. And then also, apparently Stan was counseling a man that was in his congregation that wound up being a mobster. At first, Stan said he didn't believe any of this, but when he found out the man he had been counseling had been assassinated, he knew it was true. They decided not to tell the police and instead go into hiding together because Pauline's mother knew what happened to families that snitched on the mob. And so by the end of the weekend, Pauline not only learned about this totally crazy past she had, but she also learned that she was still in danger. She asked her mother and Stan what she should do to stay safe. And Pauline's mother said, "Well, that's actually the reason we called you here now, because after all these years, we were just tired of being in hiding, and so we've already spoken to the authorities, and they've moved us into a special witness protection program for families connected to the mob. When you enter this program, it's referred to as entering the weird world, where basically you're not really safe, but you have agents that follow you around that are undercover, that track what you're doing and make sure there's no assassination attempt on you." They asked that a couple of agents monitor Pauline and her brother, even though they didn't know they were being monitored. At this point, Stan reached forward with a radio and he said, "Here's a radio that actually broadcasts to the agents that are following you pretty much all the time." She looks at her mom and Stan and she says, "Well, what happened to Dad? Is he in jail?" And at this point, Pauline's mother says, "No, he's not. He's in the weird world too." And she handed Pauline a letter that was from her father addressed to Pauline, and it basically spelled out that he had been moved into the weird world and he was looking forward to Pauline joining them at some point when she was ready. And her mother just tells her, "Go home, think about what you want to do next, and if you want to join the witness protection program and join the weird world with us, just let me know and we'll make it happen." But after only a couple of days, her paranoia was so high that she dumped her boyfriend, she quit her job, and she moved out of her house into a separate apartment, and she called her mother and said, "I can't take it anymore. I feel totally unsafe. I want to join the weird world." Her mother and Stan were delighted at her decision, but they told her it wasn't a simple process, and so Pauline's mother told her that she would be in touch with one of her agents, and they would contact Pauline when it was time for her to go. And so, anxious and scared, Pauline began to wait. But the waiting dragged on for 5 years. And in that time, Pauline met a new boyfriend, Kevin, who became her husband. And in conversations with him, Pauline started to doubt this whole mafia thing was even true. And so she decided, in order to find out if this really was a real thing, Pauline would need to set up a sting operation on her mother and Stan. And so Pauline called her mother and very convincingly told her that, "Oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was someone from the mafia. I don't know what happened, but can you tell me what to do? Should I call the police? What do I do?" And her mother said, "No, don't call the police. Whatever you do, don't call the police. I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see if he knows what to do." to. And just a couple of minutes later, Pauline's mother called back and said, okay, honey, I spoke to Stan and he spoke to the undercover agents that sit outside your house. And they said that yes, unfortunately, not one, but two men from the mafia broke into your house today. But luckily, they went up, they grabbed them, they're in custody, so you're safe now. And Pauline said, Mom, I made that up. No one's been in my apartment. I've been here the whole day. I lied to you. And it was at this point that Pauline realized her mother and Stan had been living a lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster in some Vancouver crime syndicate. It would turn out Stan was suffering from something called delusion syndrome, where totally normal people have one distinct delusion. And sometimes that delusion is not a big deal. But sometimes it is, like they believe the mafia is after them. And during his relationship with Pauline's mother, he passed on his delusion to her through something called folie à deux, which translates to madness for two, which is shared delusion syndrome, where someone who's delusional, who's a dominant personality, can pass that on to a subordinate personality. After confronting her mother and then also confronting Stan at a later date, neither of them said, this is a lie, you're right, you caught us, because they believed it, and they took to their graves the belief that the mafia was after them. Their biggest concern after Pauline said this isn't true was not that they had been exposed as potential frauds. It was that, oh no, Pauline's gonna expose herself to the mafia because she's not living in the weird world with us. And so even though Pauline never got an apology from her mother, Pauline ultimately made peace with the situation by writing a best-selling memoir called Run, Hide, Repeat. Artyom Sidorkin started having severe chest pains, and at first he tried to ignore it, but it got so bad he could barely stand up, and so finally he went to the emergency room. Just based on the way he presented to them, being pale in the face and hunched over and very sick looking, they assumed this must be something very serious. So that day they brought Mr. Sidorkin in for an examination, and after talking to him, the assumption was he probably has a tumor in his lungs. And so they sent him in for an x-ray, and afterwards the radiologist looked at the x-ray and confirmed that yep, there is a mass growing inside of your lungs. They told him that they would like to do a biopsy where they remove a small piece of the tissue and test it. And so Mr. Sidorkin is terrified, but he says okay, he schedules his surgery. He goes in a couple days later and the surgeon pulls out a piece of his lung tissue, and as it's sitting on the tray, he looks down at the tissue, the surgeon does, and he realizes there's something hidden inside of the tissue, as if the tissue was like an envelope holding something inside of it. And so he opened it up, and there, growing on the side of his lung, was a small fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, it was green, it looked very lively, it was just a thriving little tree. The doctors believed Mr. Sidorkin, who was a botanist, had inhaled a seed of a fir tree, and it got lodged inside of his lung tissue. And then as it grew, its pine needles began piercing his blood capillaries, causing him to cough up blood. A spokeswoman for the Royal Botanic Gardens in London said that it is possible for a seed to germinate inside of the dark, damp conditions inside of a lung, but it is unbelievably bizarre. When doctors informed Mr. Sidorkin that he did not have cancer, he had a tree, Mr. Sidorkin was shocked, and he said, I never got the sense that there was a tree growing inside of me. But more than shocked, he was just relieved that he was cancer-free. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time that's going to do it, see ya.